And hey, I'm Jon Foreman. I'm here with Helga Luest, who is a serious climate civic activist in Montgomery County, has been participating in the climate working group, among other things. Helga, before we start this discussion, not to bury the lead, we're going to talk about the climate working group. Many people across the county were involved in giving feedback, say, how can the county implement its climate action plan? And I'm a bit disappointed because it sounds like the county's not listening. And you're going to tell us about your experience doing that and the results and how you think things should really be going. So before we jump into that topic, tell us a bit about your civic activism and what you've been up to the last 4 years.
Oh, sure. Thank you. So I really started digging into climate change in 2018 when I ran for delegate in the District 18 of Montgomery County. And it was the questionnaire that Sierra Club and League of Conservation voters gave to the candidates to, really hear our opinions on climate related and environmental issues. That's what flipped the switch for me. And I think it's actually brilliant that they do what they do because they want the candidates to voice their opinion. It forces you to, dig in and do the research. So when you say you have an opinion on something, it's hopefully an informed one. I switched my campaign back then to the low carb campaign, low carbon footprint, because I feel that if you say that you're going to care about the environment and that you do, that you should walk the walk and be a demonstration of what that looks like. Yard signs aren't biodegradable or recyclable, so I didn't do them. And while I was running, I also enrolled in the Yale School of Public Health, their climate change and health program, to really dig into how this is, how the lack of biodiversity or the loss of biodiversity and the change in our climate, the heat extremes, the extreme weather events that we have, how that's affecting health and mental health. I completed that program. Then I went on to do the Climate Reality Leadership Corps. Then I went on from there to do the Association on Climate Change Officers. In the state of Maryland, they had a certificate program that I completed as well to have my my CCP, my climate change professional certificate. But really, it's this thirst that I've had in wanting to understand how our climate is degrading and what the steps are to lessen our carbon footprint and get us back to a sustainable, healthy place.
How serious is the problem from your perspective? How much time do we have?
I don't think we have any time. Honestly, I think we're already going to overshoot. We're going to overshoot. So we will probably warm beyond the 1.5 degrees Celsius that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said we have to hold to that number, or we're in for the worst of the weather extremes. When you look at the amount of methane, which is even more warming than carbon, the amount of methane that's being released even from the permafrost melt that we have in the Arctic, it's really concerning. And so
by the way, just to interject, where I come from, 1.5 is totally unacceptable. 1 degree is unacceptable. We need 0 degrees of warming because right now the Arctic is melting, the ice is melting. We don't know, even with the current amount of warming, when these feedback loops could kick in. And the scientists have been good, as I understand, of predicting sort of the warming that would happen, like the base amount of warming that would happen in relation to CO2, but they're not very good at the extremes. Like, for example, Michael Mann said recently, he's a climate scientist, author, last year when we had these terrible heat waves in Portland, like over 100 degrees, he said, well, our models, we have to look at the models, they're not predicting that. So the models, but the consistent news I'm hearing is it's much worse than we expected. The oceans are warming faster than we expected. The ice caps are melting faster than we expected. The extreme weather events seem to be worse than what we expected. So that to me seems to imply that there's a huge risk that feedback loops could kick in a lot sooner, and that the IPCC, what many are saying is conservative, saying, well, we need to stay below 1.5. Well, and they're saying there's a 2/3 chance of that based on their plan for emissions reductions. To me, that's not even aggressive enough.
Agreed. I think, by no argument, the IPCC is probably the most conservative prediction because it is a consensus prediction of our climate demise. But we already see massive fires. We see massive fires, we see massive floods, we see really intense storms. The discussion of having a new category of hurricane because the winds are stronger than we've ever seen before. And we know the warming of our ocean feeds into the moisture in the atmosphere, and that intensifies our storms. So we have these feedback loops, and whenever there's a big fire, we're losing trees. Well, trees are one of our most important tools. Not only do they provide canopy to keep, to control the urban heat island effect, where cities are warmer because there's so much more pavement and buildings and everything else. So trees help in that regard, but they're also one of our most powerful tools in sequestering carbon. And when we have huge amounts of forests that we're losing, we're also cutting back on our, one of our most helpful tools.
Yeah, we can't afford to lose another tree. So you've been alarmed by the climate crisis. You had an awakening, and then you went to school for it, and you've gotten involved in the county's climate work groups that are submitted their reports already to the county. Tell me about your experience with the work groups and the results that happened.
Yeah, so I want to start actually by saying one of the things that I did in the Yale program was I did an adaptation plan, and I looked specifically at a local problem. So the problem that I decided to use as my case study for this class was flooding basements. We have homes in the county that were built before 1970, before housing codes changed. When the housing codes changed, all the newer homes, they had to be built with an internal French drain and a sump pump. The older homes don't have that, and they've now aged to a point where they're no longer watertight. They're not water safe. And I experienced this in my home, where the basement flooded a year after I moved in here, and I had to remediate. And thankfully, everything is good since. But my neighbors, every time we have a severe rain, like today, people are dragging carpet out. My own neighbor said basement, like the whole basement, he tiled so he can just mop up water when there's a big rain. They aren't thinking about how that factors into home health. And if there is water, there will be mold. And where there's mold, there could be a situation of asthma or other illness. Yeah. Interestingly, Montgomery County has a much higher prevalence of asthma than the rest of the state of Maryland, and even our national average. So I decided to focus on that, and that connected me with the Department of Environmental Protection, emergency management. I started asking people, and even meeting with policymakers like Jared Solomon, Evan Glass, talking with them about how important this issue is, and could we try to do something with insurance companies or even lenders, where people take proactive action to remediate, or they do it at the time when they sell their house, that we slowly convert these older homes to be healthier and safer for people. So, and we know from Hurricane Ida, there was a situation of basement, flooding where there was loss of life. So these are real issues, I think, that have potential, and also point out the importance of cross-agency collaboration, which is something I have been working on back since 2019, but still work on with the Department of Health and Department of Environmental Protection, where we're starting to talk about how can we prepare communities for climate change and really promote resilience. And the focus there is primarily on health.
Okay, so a big motivator for you, it sounds like, getting into the climate working groups was health of folks. So it sounds like you're on a variety of working groups. Tell me about the one that was recommending stuff regarding health.
Right. So I was on the transportation work group and the electric vehicle subgroup. Then later on, I was in the community engagement and education work group, and I chaired the evidence-based communications subgroup. So our task was really to dig into the research and to find the right messaging that would engage the community and move our recommendations forward in the best way possible. Everything that we found, and we relied heavily on CDC's climate action, their BRACE model and their approach. But everything that we were looking at was pointing to what didn't work. So the science frame and the environmental frame, people were still thinking that climate change is 2050, 2100.
Right, as far as shaping communications to the general public, right? To communicate what's the seriousness of the problem.
Exactly. And we know from the Yale climate opinion maps, so they do these polls annually to see how far we're moving the needle on awareness. We know that Montgomery County, it's about 85% of our residents understand that climate change is happening, and they believe it's happening now. But the urgency to take action is something that's missing still. So what we designed in our subgroup was really a health frame, no matter what the recommendation is. So if we say we want to convert buildings to all electric, or we want to say any new buildings will have a solar source, we can point to a health co-benefit. If there are less emissions, the air quality is better, that has a health improvement for Montgomery County. If we're getting people off the roads and encouraging them to use public transportation or electric or use their feet or bike, there are less emissions, the air quality is better. It also helps that prevalence of asthma that we have. Maybe people are not having as severe asthma attacks. If we're planting more trees, as I mentioned earlier, there's the greater amount of carbon that's being sequestered in the ground, but also the canopy that keeps our community cooler. So all of these recommendations ultimately have a health co-benefit. And that's why we developed the frame as we did, because if people can see that by taking action, it's not only going to benefit their grandchildren. It's not only a legacy action that you're taking, it's going to help us right now. It will help us right now. And that's, so the science or the research in communications shows us that when people see that there's a positive benefit for themselves, they're more likely to take action. This frame was embraced by the county, and unfortunately, it was sort of downplayed when they launched the results of the work groups. That was right before COVID, I think February of 2020, when there was a big assembly of the work group members and the county council and county executive, and from our community engagement and community engagement and education work group. We had a poster, the county put together a poster, and our, the health frame was really minimized. When the recommendations were moved on to a contractor who was, paid to put together the next climate action plan, it was almost non-existent. And
the recommendations were, and by the way, the recommendations are available on the county site. I'll post the URL in the comments, but you could search for climate work group recommendations. There's a whole series of things, everything from carbon sequestration to buildings, but these were passed on to this consultant that was hired to write the climate action plan.
That's correct.
County.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And so when we took this approach to really determine how to move the whole community forward, because it is a whole community effort that has to happen if we want to reduce carbon, we thought about employers, we thought about builders, we thought about, just ordinary residents. We thought about the inequities and some of the sort of environmental justice issues that we need to factor in. And all of that was, all of those components were part of our framing of how to move Montgomery County forward. We have really aggressive goals. We were the first county in the country to declare a climate emergency. And then we said by 2027, we'll reduce carbon by 85% or 80%. Was it 80%?
Yeah,
I
80%.
think. And then 100% by 2035. We aren't reducing carbon. We haven't been reducing carbon. We're still on the upward trajectory. And
that's specific. I know it's a global trend, but even in Montgomery County, we're on an upward trajectory that's being measured.
I believe so. Yeah, we're not reducing carbon at this point.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. Nothing's actually really happened. There's been a bunch of talk and no action, essentially. I mean, we're not really aggressively increasing our share of clean energy. We're not aggressively increasing solar. We're not aggressively increasing wind and storage. And we haven't changed the building codes to say you can't use natural gas in new constructions. That you have to, because if you're using natural gas, that's a fossil fuel. Everything has to go to electric, which is supplied by clean energy. That has to happen. That hasn't been done. So all the, excuse me for being blunt, but the folks that passed the climate emergency resolution on the council and the folks that are obligated to uphold the law are not doing anything. Really, barely. It's not happening.
We are clearly not doing enough. At the beginning of the pandemic, right, when everything shut down, there were reports from China that their carbon reduced in the first 2 weeks, it reduced by 30%. We can do this. We didn't need a pandemic to show us, but we can reduce carbon. We all have to be in it though. And that's the bigger problem. And when we ignore the importance of engaging every single resident, I can say, okay, I'm washing my clothes in cold water so it reduces energy. That's a really tiny, minuscule little thing, right? It's really, the builders and the big companies and the big buildings, they're the ones that have the biggest environmental footprint. But really, our collective action is what's needed. It has to come from every single person in the community. And for all of us to have an awareness that, we want to protect what we have
Let me ask you about that. So, I'm all for people doing individual actions and the community getting together to do stuff, but ultimately I have a bias to say that we really need just systemic change at the government level, at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. The laws need to change to save our butts from this climate crisis. I see that as priority one because, a lot of people, as you said, and I can't remember if you said it before we started talking after, but people, I think you said 85% of the people in the county are aware of the climate crisis, or more politely, the climate change, and that we need to do something, but nobody really understands the urgency of it. And so it's a huge battle to convince people, even people that, just my experience talking to people, like people understand it, but in the end, they're not going to shut their gas fireplace off because it's pleasant. They're not going to run it. Maybe some people will, but a lot of people aren't. So it really has to be a systemic thing. We need legislation. We need the government. We need our leaders to step up and communicate the severity of the crisis, take emergency action at the executive level, governorship, presidentship, whatever, county council executive. They need to take emergency action, and they need to communicate like it's emergency, and they need to actually pass legislation, serious legislation, like any new home, if it can have solar, it has to have solar, and it can't use gas. It has to be a clean electricity household as much as possible. So anyway, I'm just saying that because, like, what are your thoughts about that? How do we balance the systemic change versus people doing individual things and, communities coming together to do stuff on their own? Like, I guess it has to be all of the above, but I kind of think the systemic thing is the most important.
I think we're on the same page there. I think the most important tool you have to fight climate change is your vote. Yeah. Really, and to really look for candidates who will walk the walk and make these bold strides forward, because it will take bold action, and it's not going to be easy, and it has to be equitable. And the policies have to be designed in a way where we think about environmental justice and equity, so that the people that have less, who are often the ones that feel the worst effects, that we find pathways to incentivize them, to make it possible for them to, to move forward in a healthier way. And I think that, of course, the most impactful would be at the federal level, because that, that has a much bigger impact on communities all across our country. But at the local level too, it's not enough to just say, I realize there's a climate crisis. I realize that, we need to reduce carbon. So then what are we actually doing about it? What is the plan? And, we have a climate action plan, but what are the actions? It doesn't really even spell out the timeline specifically and how this is going to help us reach our goals. These goals aren't lofty goals. These goals are essential goals. It's
Yep.
part of what we need to do to
Survival
protect our
goals.
residents. Yeah, it's protecting life. It's protecting our homes, our livelihoods, our families. So voting is absolutely, it's what will move us the most quickly.
So
All those small actions, though, they also are important. And I think it's an important demonstration for one neighbor to see another doing the transition, making the effort, really thinking about how they're recycling and being thoughtful about what goes where, and what can actually be recycled. So these are important steps in our collective action.
So let's get back to the working group. So the working group, it sounded like you were chair. Tell me again, you chaired the committee that was specifically about communications?
Yeah, the evidence-based communications subcommittee. Yep.
So you submitted your recommendations and compare what the consultant who created the climate action plan actually implemented versus what your recommendations were, and so forth and so on.
Well, our recommendation was to use the health frame as a way to communicate all of the climate actions and recommendations that the county wants to embrace. But that frame was absent from the plan. And so so some of these plans are just going to happen behind the scenes, but others that require community participation and engagement, they're now absent that framework that we know from evidence, from the research, that this is the most effective path forward. So it's an unfortunate disconnect. I'm not sure why it was left out, but it really, when we're talking about the kind of large scale community focused or community, the energy has to come from the community to really take these actions. And for us not to have a plan for how to communicate with them effectively, or even how to measure their awareness and their engagement over time, that, I don't know if that was intentional. I mean, maybe it was, because maybe folks don't want to really know if we're moving the needle and getting people more active and involved and aware and engaged in climate action.
So is this a consistent theme? I mean, a lot of people put in a lot of work in these climate work group recommendations. You were on several committees. Is this a consistent theme that the consultant just wasn't listening? Because, I mean, and let me just be open, like my thesis and being an activist involved in this stuff, like, at first you kind of say, okay, we trust our leaders. They're in it for good faith. They want to get things done. And then you see them say certain things and promise certain things. You work to get them elected and then it doesn't happen. And then you say, okay, well, this is good. They're asking the community for feedback and getting these experts that are concerned about the climate and have a lot of knowledge to do all this work. But my cynical approach is attitude these days, somewhat cynical, is that often this is just a distraction and it's used to maybe not consciously, but ultimately it just slows down the entire process when we know what we actually need to do anyway, and distracts people. People invest a lot of time and energy to get something done, and then it's ignored. And this seems to be a consistent theme that happens throughout our institutions, especially government.
Yeah, this wasn't the first climate action plan, as you know. And,
Yeah.
you know, when you look at how much is actually implemented and measured over time, it's, you know, I question whether it's just placating the climate activists and the environmental groups, or whether we're really serious about, you know, are we serious about solving a problem? If we're serious
Yeah.
about solving a problem, then though all those people that spent, you know, months of our lives and hours in our weeks doing research and coming together and having these in-depth discussions about what actually could and should happen, what are the best practices, what are we learning from communities in Europe who have gone through substantial transformation. You know, we spent the time doing that because we care, because we realize that we're in a point of crisis. There was no effort made to keep us together after the work groups were done,
Meaning
and no effort to include
all
us.
the individual, when you say keep us together, meaning all the individuals working in the different work groups,
Yes.
keep you together as a team of some
I mean,
sort?
that's from my perspective, that was a huge resource. We learned so much from each other, and we all did it voluntarily and because of our commitment to this community and to addressing climate change. So you have hundreds of people who are willing and able and actually very knowledgeable. We have such a wealth of you know, information and scientists, people working at EPA, people working at HHS at the federal level, also people that can, you know, that are working at the federal level that have insights to funding streams that we aren't taking advantage of. So this is a way not only to use all of our resource and having you know, real support and knowledge come from the community, but it's a way for us to also expand the possibility and the potential of what we're doing, because we're now tying into new funding opportunities, or we're hearing about other, you know, potential partnerships, or we're learning from a community that's implemented a change and we're able to learn from their lessons so that we can get there faster. You know, this it's a real missed opportunity, I think, to have just disbanded the work groups and say, okay, now a consultant's going to take this forward, you know, and then.
Right, because you guys learned a lot, you invested your time and you care passionately about it, meaning you could have continued to work to submit recommendations and flesh through ideas and work with the government and the consultant to achieve a more positive outcome. Is that kind of what you're shooting for?
Well, I think that's part of it, but I mean, imagine if the county asked each of the work groups, take on one project. So maybe the adaptation and sequestration group, they look at rain gardens and they do a, you know, a case study of a place that, you know, consistently has flooding issues, and they work together and also this builds community strength, right? Those relationships strengthen in community. So we have them work on a rain garden and then report back to the county the results. Then we can say, okay, we know this has worked in one place, let's replicate it. And then talk to some of the civic associations. Who can we get involved, like, to problem solve at the community level?
Yeah.
And I think that working together, that's part of community resilience. It's building those relationships, it's problem solving together, it's taking best practices and bringing them to life at the local level. And that piece of it has really been missing.
So it sounds like you're proposing, like, I mean, there's a lot of, just scrolling through this, there's a lot of recommendations. Maybe one of the working groups could have focused on like the highest priority item and said, okay, let's dive into the details of how to implement this, make some recommendations for actual policies to be implemented by the government, but also reach out to various community groups to, you know, build connections and see if we can get folks together to start implementing these things. Is that kind of
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think, also if we're looking to transform buildings, starting conversations with the building management companies, who's willing to come to the table and what are they willing to commit to without a policy change? Not everything has to happen in policy. I think sometimes if you don't ask, you don't get. But if enough members of the community ask, then maybe people will be moved to action.
There is something to be said for social pressure.
It's
Okay,
just asking people to step up and do the right thing
yeah,
because we don't have time. We don't.
yeah, agreed. So could you talk a little bit more about the scientific conclusions around the communication frame of health? You mentioned that communicating the climate crisis and the climate solutions and how they have a health benefit appeal to a person's self-interest. Like, I want to be healthier. I want to have clean water. I want to have cleaner air. Can you tell me a little bit more about those findings if you happen to know about them or
Yeah. So, it's based on a number of different behavioral, sort of social behavioral health and change philosophies and theories. But what we see from the research is that when people see a positive benefit for their health and also for their kids and their grandkids, that they take a greater interest. They want to know, if their water quality can be better, if their air quality can be better, if they have a health issue. If they have a health issue and they know that by taking certain steps, this can potentially help them, then they're more likely to move to action than if it's, about the trees, about the butterflies and the bees and, loss of biodiversity. It
yeah.
it becomes less personal and more removed, and people are less likely to act and much less likely to act quickly.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times the climate crisis isn't framed in, well, we got to do this for future generations or the younger generation. Well, personally, I'm worried about myself. I mean, I'm obviously worried about everybody I love and my nieces and nephews and, folks that are younger than me. But we just don't know we don't know really how much time we have. Feedback loops could kick in and we could be living in a dystopia at some point in the nearer future than many people think. And boy, that's self-interest right there. Anyway, as an aside, so tell me about here's one interesting thing I heard about. You mentioned regarding air quality in Montgomery County. I understand that the rating is like a B+ or something positive, but all the surrounding counties are pretty bad air quality ratings. Now, I understand that an activist, the Civic Fed, had done some research, and there's one air quality detector in Montgomery County that's placed for this data, and guess where it's placed? It's placed in a sea of green. It's not placed off of I-270 or in downtown Wheaton or Silver Spring or Glenmont. It's placed in a sea of green somewhere. Well, of course, that's going to make our air quality look better. So do you have a sense of, I know that why is the air quality bad in MoCo? Why do we have a higher rate of asthma? How could we have a higher rate of asthma for supposedly such decent air quality in MoCo? Is it really decent? We've got the Dickerson plant in Montgomery County burning coal, and presumably the jet stream is heading eastward, carrying those particles across the county. It could be contributing to it. We have God knows how many tons of CO2 emitted by gas guzzling SUVs and combustion engine vehicles across the county. Do you have a sense of what's going on with the air quality? Why is the asthma rate so high in Montgomery County? Is it mostly outdoor?
So I think it's a pretty complicated, that's a pretty complicated question and has
Yeah.
multiple answers. I think part of it is our emissions and the air pollution. I think part of it is access to adequate health care. You know, honestly, if we wanted to really understand our air quality, we would have multiple sensors around the county, and some in neighborhoods that are, you know, heavily trafficked, and
Yes.
also, you know, where some of the poorest of our, you know, members of community are. And we need to understand, you know, when there's a situation like with asthma, that also requires, you know, sort of loss. If someone has to go to the ER, they miss school, a parent misses work, that has an economic impact. There are, you know, a lot of factors to this. So it's really understanding, you know, how, and you know, another really important health component is the mental health piece. So in on the other side of my life, I focus a lot on mental health. I chair the mental health advisory committee for the county. And a year ago, I talked to the committee and said, let's do something proactive instead of reactive. Let's have a committee that focuses on climate change and resilience, and try to get our, you know, our local government talking about what resilience looks like, because we know from the pandemic, we had a collective trauma. All of us were affected by the pandemic and the disconnection or social isolation for months and years. So the committee agreed, and we've since been working with HHS and with DEP, and really been talking about what does, from a mental health standpoint, what does community resilience look like? And the discussions have been, you know, have been great. Dr. Santiago at HHS, he's been sort of leading the charge, but has also brought members from the, both from, well, actually someone I worked with on the evidence-based communications work group to present to management and leadership in DHHS. And now they're starting to really think about, okay, we don't really factor in how climate change is affecting all these health and human service programs, but we need to start doing that. And they're thinking about it. And so, you know, these are just some small steps, but, you know, these are important steps for our community and to keep us all connected and healthy.
Okay. Well, is there anything else you wanted to share regarding the climate work group recommendations in general and what was implemented in the climate action plan?
You know, I guess if I were talking to our county council and county executive and other leaders in the community and government, really think back to the resource that we had in the work groups and how that resource could be reactivated and used to carry things forward. And, you know, from the standpoint of the climate action plan, I think that it's not really an action plan if there isn't action. And our, you know, I'm someone that really looks to see where action is happening. Many members of our community are a little more passive and, you know, wouldn't really see it unless we make a big deal out of it. We're not demonstrating action in Montgomery County, and we need to really make that a priority.
Okay, well, let's keep pushing for action. Helga Luest, thank you so much for your time and sharing your thoughts and experience on all this.
Thank you.